Estás viendo El Tiempo en vivo.
Muy buenos días a todos los que nos acompañan a esta transmisión especial del tiempo.com. Mi nombre es Sergio Gómez Maceri, soy el corresponsal de la Casa Editorial del Tiempo en Washington y hoy estamos aquí para hablar de las próximas elecciones presidenciales de Estados Unidos de este martes 5. Sí, hoy nos acompaña un invitado muy especial, se trata de Jeff Lane, el profesor Lane. Trabaja en la Facultad de Gobierno de American University, una de las universidades más prestigiosas de la capital estadounidense. El profesor Lane es subsecretario de Energía, o fue subsecretario de Energía, perdón, y trabajó durante 15 años en el Congreso como asesor legislativo. Muy buenos días a este programa, profesor Lane. Good morning, Professor Lane. How are you doing?
Good morning. How are you, Sergio?
Thanks for taking this invitation to talk to this in this critical moment.
Good to be with you.
Okay, so let's start, Professor, by we are 5 days or 4 days or days away from the election, and at least according to the polls, this seems to be one of the closest in modern history. So why don't we start there? What's your forecast? What are you seeing? Where things stand right now?
Well, I think, as you say, it is close. The polls show that it's close. Of course, in the U.S., we have voting by the Electoral College, so by states. So the focus is on 7 so-called battleground states in which the election is expected to be decided. And in listening to some accounts of the polls last night, it appears that in every one of those states, it is literally a toss-up if you are following the latest polls. So both candidates are focusing on those 7 states. I think for Kamala Harris, her focus is more on the states of Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. If she wins those states, in addition to a congressional district in Nebraska, which I think she's expected to win, she will be at the magic 270 electoral votes total to win the election. She's also, and both candidates are focused on the other battleground states of the so-called Sunbelt states, Arizona, Nevada, and then over to the southeastern part of the country, Georgia and North Carolina are those remaining 4 battleground states. And each of those states have sort of a different demographic makeup, and there are different challenges for each candidate and appealing to voters there. But it is really coming down to the wire.
So why do you think it is so close? I mean, it wasn't that close in 2020. But now we've seen, especially in the last weeks, a tightening of the election. So why do you think we are coming down to this in only 7 states and with that minimal margins between them?
Well, I think generally I would say that in the U.S., our presidential elections are close. We haven't had a landslide election since the late 80s. Last election, yes, was, well, I would say the last election was pretty close because in those battleground states, and there are many of the same, or basically the same set of battleground states that decided the 2020 election, Joe Biden won, for instance, in the state of Wisconsin by 20,000 votes. He won the state of Georgia by 11,000 votes. Even though he won the popular vote by several million votes, of course, that's not how we decide our elections. So in those key states, the election was close, and I expect it again to be close in those same states. Now, you also have the added factor of the very unusual situation where Joe Biden pulled out of the race in favor of his vice president, Kamala Harris. That's unprecedented. She's only had about 100 days to mount a campaign. I think most observers believe that she's mounted a pretty strong campaign, but nevertheless, we're a closely divided country. Our parties are closely divided. It's a polarized electorate and very difficult for there to be sort of a decisive win by either side, I think, in the modern U.S. presidential election.
So what do you think have been the deciding factors, the big themes of this election? and who is doing better on them?
Well, it's interesting because I think the Biden administration and Kamala Harris, who's the vice president, is most vulnerable on the economic issues, inflation, which has been, of course, a worldwide problem after the pandemic, but has probably been the most difficult issue for her to deal with because it's just been a fact of life in the U.S. Now, economic growth has been pretty strong, unemployment has been low, but I think people feel the inflation issue more. You know, you go to the grocery store, you buy gas, you continue to see high prices. I think it's interesting that the Trump campaign, while it certainly talked about inflation, it has tended to focus on issues. Um, the issue of immigration has probably been their, when you look at the ads that they've run, they focused on immigration and on cultural issues like transgender issues, for instance. They have been more focused on that side, which I don't think are necessarily their best issues. I think people are most concerned about the economy. And if you look at polls, a majority of people trust Trump on the economy more than they trust Kamala Harris, even though she's been narrowing that gap. On Harris' side, it's reproductive rights, the abortion issue, clearly the top issue, in addition to just concerns about our democracy and concerns about Trump's character she's trying to raise and remind people of, the January 6th riot and insurrection, concerns about what he would do in a second administration. That's really been her focus, but she's had to deal also with the economic issues. And I think she's tried to differentiate herself a little bit from the Biden administration on a few fronts there.
So it's interesting that you mentioned the economics, because it's always been, it's the economy, stupid, famous phrase.
Right.
But when you see the economy, the U.S. economy as of right now, the snapshot, as you were saying, it looks pretty solid. I mean, there was a 2.8 growth. Gas prices are low. Unemployment is low. Stock market is, solid. In every front, and even in the inflation, last numbers for the inflation were 2.1, which is on target. However, 53% of the country or more say the country is not going in the right direction, specifically in the economic front. So why do you think, even though the economy, and it's the economy again, doing well, it's not translating into what people feel and consider it to be a weakness for this administration?
No, it's a great question and a difficult one to explain. I think people tend to feel these things later than they show up in the newspaper as a statistic, right? I mean, there's 2.8 growth, 2.1 inflation. I think inflation is just so visible and immediate for people. They walk into the grocery store, they look at the service station gasoline price. Now, I will say, I think the public is moving a little bit on this issue. Yesterday, if I heard this correctly, the Consumer Confidence Index, which is one index of how people are feeling about the economy, had improved. You see, as I said, the gap between Harris and Trump on economic issues in the polling has narrowed. I think from about 15 points to something under 10 points. He's still a little bit ahead of her, but I do think that some of that, the reality of the economy is beginning to be felt by people. As you say, inflation is down to 2.1%. But I think inflation was just sort of a shock to our system post-pandemic. That's been very difficult for the Biden administration to get over in the public psyche, just because for so many years we had such a low inflation rate and people just weren't accustomed to it. And I think of all the economic indicators, whether it's gross domestic product or unemployment, inflation has the most sort of immediate impact, visible impact on people. And while that has improved, I think it's still, people still feel it. And if you look worldwide, it's been very difficult for incumbent parties to deal with some of the economic fallout, which I would attribute, largely to the pandemic, particularly inflation coming out of the pandemic with supply chain issues and other issues that are too complicated to get into here. But I just think the Biden administration and Kamala Harris by association has had a difficult time dealing with the inflation issue in particular. But I do think it has improved for them. And that's why I think she has a decent chance to win this election.
But going back to that point, what explains the resilience of Donald Trump? I mean, we're talking of a candidate who had been criminally convicted, who was being called a fascist by his top generals and other people that work in administration with him. He has approached using the armed forces and the Justice Department to go after his enemies, et cetera, et cetera. And even so, he could be president next Tuesday. So what explains his appeal despite even his own people that work with him criticizing him? What explains his appeal in the general population?
Well, I think you have to begin with what I talked about earlier, the polarization in our electorate. Voters identify by party very strongly. They are accustomed to voting for their party at the presidential level and every level down the ballot, Congress, local elections. And that's become a story of our politics for the last 20 or 30 years, something I talk about in my classes a lot. So he begins with that sort of base, right? And I think the base of voters that he has gained over time find appeal in his challenge to elites, which the Democratic Party is more associated with. I think there's a cultural affinity for him. Pick your issue on the cultural side. He attacks, for instance, diversity, equity, and inclusion policies, the woke culture, so-called liberalism and progressivism in the country that Republicans traditionally have not supported and opposed very strongly. So I think he's tapped into sort of a cultural divide in our country, and he benefits from the polarization that we have, so that, he's going to get 45, 47% of the vote almost without question. But the problem for him, I think, is there could very well be a ceiling that's in that 47, 48% range. And the question is, can Harris win most of that undecided vote, which is now in sort of the 4 to 5% range? And then the question becomes, how does that translate into those battleground states? Because again, you can't just judge it by the national popular vote. Explaining the Trump phenomenon and his popularity, I think, is a challenge, particularly in light of, the legal troubles that he's undergone. I think, again, for his base voters, they see those legal problems as an attack by the other side, right? That he has been attacked unfairly by the other side. So in some ways, being convicted in the spring in that New York case energized his base, because they saw it as just another example of what they would call the weaponization of our justice system against Donald Trump. And he's quick to say that he's a victim of that.
Going back to the polls, what we're all seeing is a very tight race. Mm-hmm. However, Democrats seem to be much more in panic mode, seeing those same numbers as Republicans do. If you hear what Republicans are saying, they're actually kind of, we're going to win in a landslide kind of mood, while Democrats are very anxious. So what explains that? Is it because there were errors in past polling that they think are going to show up again this year, or is this just a mind frame?
Well, I think it's an interesting sort of difference in philosophy. I think Democrats tend to be a little bit more nervous about these things. Is sort of the nature of the Democratic Party. But I think the Harris campaign is very concerned about keeping people energized and working and doing the things here at the end that will potentially make the difference. Doing knocking on doors, making calls to potential voters, getting people to the voting booth, sort of the turnout operation. And I do think they actually have an advantage in that they have more infrastructure in these key states. And I think their philosophy is, well, I think they genuinely believe it's going to be close. I think they have a kind of a quiet confidence that they're going to win, but they don't want to express that because they don't want people to get overconfident. I think on the Republican side, they want to encourage confidence. Some are arguing they're doing that because they want to create this impression that if Trump loses, it must have been because of fraud or cheating, which Trump has talked about repeatedly, really since 2020, so that the narrative would be, well, we were so far ahead in the polls, how could this possibly have happened if Harris wins? And then if you are challenging the election in court, your supporters are more likely to be with you because the story they heard before the election was, oh, Trump was going to win in a landslide. And the fact is, neither of them is going to win in a landslide.
Going just to do like a prediction of what could happen, what would a Trump 2.0 administration mean, and what would a Harris administration bring?
Well, there's a lot to cover there, but I think, clearly the Trump administration will follow sort of the standard Republican approach to government, which is to deregulate, to try to reduce some of the government spending, although they have not been very successful at that over the last couple of decades. More conservative approach to issues like reproductive rights, certainly. There would be no effort to codify Roe v. Wade, for instance, which is what Kamala Harris has proposed to do. He would leave the abortion issue to the states, I think most likely. There's something called Project 2025, which is about a 900-page document that was produced by the Heritage Foundation, which is a Republican-oriented think tank. A lot of the Harris administration has certainly tried to tie Trump to that. He's said that, no, that's not my governing document. I think the biggest issue with Trump will be who does he surround himself with. In the first term, I think there were people who were inclined to sort of pull him back on certain issues. And I don't think those people will be around in this next term. I should also say that on the economic front, he would impose tariffs, and he does have a lot of, and he said this, he does have a lot of discretion to do that under existing law. In other words, he wouldn't have to go to Congress to say, hey, I want to slap a 20% tariff on this or that product. And he's talked about doing it really across the board as really the prime part of his economic agenda. And the other thing at the top of his agenda is deporting so-called illegal immigrants, and how he's going to identify them is, the real question, and how extensive will that be, and does he involve the military in that? So that's very, very controversial. So deporting up to 10 to 20 million people in this country, the economic impact of that, of course, the Harris campaign says that would be a dramatic impact because those people are workers and key parts of our economy. So immigration has been a big issue. I think Harris actually has moved to the a little bit more conservative position on immigration, but certainly not nearly as far as Trump, who's talking about deportation. I think Harris has started to talk about what she calls the opportunity economy. She wants to give a tax credit to people who have children, to give a tax credit to first-time home buyers, very sort of targeted efforts to help middle-income people, low-income people. She's also talked about price gouging to try to control that. She's argued that some of these grocery prices are in fact the result of producers and sellers of these products overpricing them. So again, a sort of a very targeted agenda on the economic front. I think on the national security, foreign affairs side, Trump has made what a lot of people would call isolationist statements, threatened to get out of NATO. He said he'll end the war in Ukraine immediately and, take care of things in the Middle East. So there's a lot of bravado there without a lot of clear plans for doing that. But I think the situation internationally will be very different. Harris, I think, would continue the Biden approach, which is support Ukraine, support Israel, but also urge Israel to take care in how it prosecutes the war in Gaza, to support more humanitarian efforts in Gaza. So I think here the Democrats would be more internationalists, pro-NATO, certainly pro-Israel, but a bit more moderate in their approach to that. And Trump increasingly, I think, would take us down the isolationist path. Would he get out of NATO? Would he not support Ukraine? Those are questions, I think.
Finally, Professor Lane, how worried are you that we're walking into a scenario like the one that played out in 2020 in this election? I ask because the polls are very tight. The outcome is very uncertain. And if one thing we know at this point is that Donald Trump and the Republican Party has begun to set up and talk about the possibility of a fraud. And we know how that ended last time with January 6th, Trump supporters taking over the Capitol and people dying. So how concerned are you that we're walking down that path?
Well, I'm concerned about any false allegations about campaign fraud. I think pretty clear from evidence that the 2020 election was legitimate, that was secure, there wasn't substantial fraud, and the investigations that followed about January 6th, we discovered that that's what Trump's own advisors were telling him. The Trump campaign in 2020 went to court, I think, 61 times, and only won one court case with allegations of fraud. So the courts in 2020 were clear that there was no fraud. I don't expect there to be any widespread fraud here, but I do expect the Trump campaign, if they are losing, to allege that there's widespread fraud. They've already begun to bring court cases, legal challenges to some of the voting procedures, registration procedures in these battleground states. So I think there will certainly be a lot of drama around that issue. I have pretty strong confidence that our court system will hold, that if in fact there is no widespread fraud, that the courts will affirm that and not disallow votes. So yes, I think certainly if Trump is losing, there will be a lot of activity in the courts. I think the Democrats are prepared for years to deal with that. I do think that there were some reforms made with the process in Congress that will make it more difficult to challenge the vote, as was attempted on January 6th, the so-called decertification of these states' electoral college votes. Congress passed a law a couple of years ago to reform that, so that, for instance, Trump had urged his Vice President, Mike Pence, to simply reject the votes. I don't think that would have worked, but this bill that was passed makes it very clear that the Vice President cannot do that, sort of as a reaction to what Trump attempted to do in 2020. So I do think there are some safeguards in place. I think they're strong. That doesn't mean it's not going to be dramatic and nerve-wracking for people who are concerned about the integrity of our elections and democracy and the future of democracy here in the U.S. But I think the courts held in 2020. I would expect them to hold again in 2024. But we could see, a month or more of very dramatic action around these allegations of fraud.
Okay, well, I guess we will find out the answer to that question starting on Tuesday, although we clearly know that there's probably not an announcement of who will be president on Wednesday morning, and we'll have to wait at least a couple of days.
Right.
In any case, Professor Lane, as always, many thanks for taking the time and joining us in this important conversation, and let's see what happens on Tuesday.
Thank you, Sergio.
Thanks very much.
La inmediatez, veracidad y confiabilidad de la información son vitales en la era digital. Por eso, suscríbete a nuestro canal de YouTube y entérate de las últimas noticias, especiales, entrevistas, documentales y mucho más contenido. Somos El Tiempo.